Hi, my name is Alexis Grimaldo and you're watching Fully Exposed Episode 2. Today we're going to be talking about shutter speed. Shutter speed is a mechanism inside your camera that dictates the amount of light that hits your film, or CCD in a digital SLR. And basically it's just a timer. It opens and exposes the film and closes. So the higher number, the faster the shutter speed. The lower the number, the slower the shutter speed. So here's an example of an old 60s Spotmatic that I have, and you'll probably be able to tell, but I have it right now on half of a second, so you'll be able to see it open and close slowly. Okay, now if I speed it up to, let's say 1/15 of a second, you'll see it be faster. Okay, and let's go ahead and ramp it up to 1/1000th of a second. Okay, so that's basically it. It opens and closes mechanically or electronically, I guess, on a digital camera, and that dictates the amount of light that it hits the film. Okay, the ways in most cases that you adjust your shutter speed on this camera, for example, to dial on top here, easy to find on most cameras, and it just, it starts at B, which is bulb, which means when you hit it, it stays open the whole time that this is pressed. It just stays open the whole time. Great for night photography, stuff like that. You have to use a tripod, obviously, because the cameras shake. But that's what B means. And then the numbers from 1 second, 1/2 of a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second, all the way up to 1/1000th of a second on this camera. Some cameras do go past that. Some cameras go to 2/1000th of a second and stuff. But let's just say for standard cameras, 1/1000th of a second is pretty common. Okay, basically how shutter speed affects an image. Not only do the slower times let in more light, so you get more light in a lower light situation or when you need it, but also the faster speeds are better for capturing things that are moving. Spokes on a bike that's riding by, anything going by fast, you want to ramp up the shutter speed. I would probably say 1/25th of a second to 250th of a second to even 500th of a second. Those are your pretty high up there as far as shutter speeds go, and that can capture and freeze the image. Whereas if you go down 1/60th of a second, and lower, or even it'll be blurred, which is kind of cool, I guess, to some degree. If you're moving with the subject and you hit a picture, you want the background to be blurred and them to kind of be, stationary. That's a good way of doing that effect. But in most cases with SLRs, for example, the shutter speed safely, I would say maybe you could try 1/30th of a second handheld, but the mirror on these cameras has a slap. And that slap is also what limits the camera from actually being still at lower shutter speeds. So 1/60th of a second is a pretty good safe speed you can stay at. The lens you're using does affect also. If you have a shorter lens like a 35mm or 28mm, even a 50, you can get by with a slower shutter speed, let's say 1/30th of a second. But once you start getting a longer telephoto lens, 150mm, 200mm, 300mm, the camera is going to be prone to shaking more, so you're going to want to juice up that shutter speed as well so you don't get camera shake, because the image will blur. And that's in SLR cameras. In rangefinder cameras, there is no mirror that slaps, so the vibration from the mirror is pretty much eliminated out of the equation. So you can actually hold the camera pretty still and get shutter speeds pretty comfortable at 1/15th of a second or even below. I shoot all the time at 1/15th of a second and have no problem with it, as long as what you're shooting isn't moving around too much. This is my Leica, once again, my M3, and you can see here where there's no mirror compared to the Pentax that I showed you earlier. Okay, that just basically has the curtain but with no mirror. Another thing about shutter speed in relation to flash, your camera in most cases is synced up to a certain shutter speed with the flash. For example, this Pentax has got an X by the 60th of a second mark, and that means that a 60th of a second is the only shutter speed you could really use a flash with. If you go any faster than that, it won't sync up and you'll get half the image blacked out, from the curtain or whatever. So when you use a flash with the camera, remember that you should pay attention to what your shutter speed sync is, and you want to set it to that and leave it to that, and then you just basically, depending on you use the aperture to adjust the exposure at that point. And this is how your shutter speed and your aperture work together. Okay, on the camera you have different shutter speeds. You have 30th of a second, 60th of a second, 1/25th of a second. Now each one of these steps is exactly in relation to each stop on on your f-stop, on your lens, on your aperture. So remember we were talking about apertures. So let's say, okay, for example, let's say the perfect exposure for this picture you're taking is f8 at 1/60th of a second. Okay, that's perfect exposure right in the middle. Well, let's just say, for example, you want to shoot it at a little bit faster shutter speed. So you want to go to 1/25th of a second because the subject is maybe moving around a little bit. You don't want it to blur. So you go to 1/25th of a second. Okay, that's one speed up. And what happens is that because you're moving the shutter speed quicker, it lets in less light. So to compensate, you have the f8, right? Well, you have to open that aperture one stop more open to f5.6. So then the correct exposure will be f5.6 at 1/25th of a second, which is exactly the same as f8 at 1/60th of a second. Now it's basically, they link up. So you know, as I move higher, one more higher shutter speed, I go to 2/50th of a second, you know, and then at that point I'm letting in less light again by one stop. So I want to open the lens again. So from 5/6 I want to go down to f4. So then f4 and 250th of a second are linked up. Now it might sound a little complicated, but it's really pretty simple. Each stop on the lens aperture ring is correlated to each shutter speed adjustment on the shutter speed. So you'll see that depending on what you want to shoot and what kind of effect you want, or you know, then you'll be able to move around. Now personally, I mostly shoot I would say 1/30th of a second to 1/15th of a second, and darker light situations where I need more exposure. And then I really don't shoot a whole lot of moving subjects. I mean, so I personally don't have much of a need to go above 1/60th of a second shutter speed. Now another reason why you might want to go up in faster shutter speeds is in case you're like in a bright sunny day and you have 400 speed film or something, faster film, and it's basically going to overexpose. Even with your aperture at f16 or f22, you've run out of aperture. You're basically at the smallest hole, letting in the least light, but it's still going to overexpose. So at that point, you turn your dial, your shutter speed up, so that way you're basically letting in less light. That'd be another reason to use the faster shutter speeds. Not necessarily because you're shooting something that's moving faster, but because you want to, expose correctly. You want to let in less light. So that's basically it. If you remember that on an SLR camera, not to maybe go below 1/30th of a second, 1/60th. 1/60th of a second is a good shutter speed. I really don't, suggest going too much lower than that, especially handheld, without using a tripod or anything like that. And then also remember your flash sync. Your camera has its own flash sync shutter speed. The faster the shutter speed, the higher the number, the less light comes in. And also, the same premise with the aperture. The higher the number of the aperture, the less light comes in. So that's kind of how it works there. And I hope this has been helpful to somebody, and you can definitely, like I said, play around with your light meter, experiment with different shutter speeds and aperture settings, and you can kind of see the exposure moving around. And I happen to personally use a lot more of aperture settings than I do shutter speeds. I kind of set my shutter speed at a certain speed for what I'm shooting, and that's pretty much it. If I'm going to be shooting a faster motion thing, I'll set it on 125 and leave it there. If I'm going to be shooting anything slower, I can, 1/30th, leave it there on my Leica, or 1/60th of a second on this and leave it. So you don't really have to mess around with it too much. You just make it easy for yourself, and just kind of, you mess around with the shutter speed. You can get a lot more. I usually end up adjusting the aperture a lot more for exposure, personally. Well, I hope this episode has helped you guys get the grasp of manual photography, including shutter speed now with aperture. Have fun and keep shooting and keep experimenting, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace!